In the floor of nearly every ceremonial chamber built by the ancient Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest, there is a small, deliberate hole no larger than a fist. It is called a sipapu, and according to Hopi tradition, it marks the exact point where the first humans climbed up out of a previous world, beneath this one, into the light. 8,000 miles away, in the temples of ancient Egypt, priests described a realm called the Duat, a dark territory the sun itself had to cross every single night before it could rise again, fighting off the forces of chaos in total darkness. In the mountains of Greece, storytellers described a god ruling a vast kingdom beneath the earth, a place the living were never meant to see and the dead could never leave. 3 civilizations, 3 continents, no shared language, no shared contact, and yet the same architecture of belief. Somewhere beneath our feet, there is another world. Why would human cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, keep arriving at the same idea independently? That is the mystery this investigation sets out to examine, and the answer turns out to braid together real psychology, real archaeology, real geology, and one of history's most persistent pieces of pseudoscience. We will not claim that an inner Earth civilization exists today. We will not claim that Agartha has been proven, that giants guard underground entrances, or that any deity named Enki ruled a literal physical kingdom beneath the surface of the planet. What we can do is trace, carefully and honestly, why this single idea, a hidden realm below, shows up almost everywhere humans have ever told stories. But where exactly should an investigation like this even begin? Let's begin with the shape of the myth itself, because before we ask whether any of it is true, we need to understand what, exactly, billions of people across history actually believed. The earliest layer of this story is not occult or esoteric at all. It is simply how early human societies tried to explain death, the night sky, caves, volcanoes, and the unsettling fact that the ground beneath a person's feet clearly continued downward into darkness no one could see the bottom of. A world below became a natural place to put everything ordinary. Daylight experience could not explain. The dead, the unborn, the dangerous, the divine. That instinct alone does not require any lost civilization or hidden technology. But it does raise an immediate question. Did every culture imagine the same kind of underworld? Or did they diverge in ways that tell us something deeper about each society's specific fears and hopes? Greek tradition described Hades as a realm of the dead, governed by rules rather than torment, divided into distinct regions for distinct kinds of souls, ruled by judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iacchus, who weighed how a person had lived rather than punishing existence itself. The story of Orpheus, who journeyed into Hades to bargain for his wife's return, only to lose her again at the very threshold of the living world, became one of the most retold descent narratives in the ancient Mediterranean. A story about the underworld's rules being unbreakable even for the most determined visitor. Egyptian tradition described the Duat as a perilous nightly journey, divided into 12 sectors, representing the 12 hours of night, through which the sun god had to travel and fight off chaos before dawn could occur again, with the deceased required to pass a sequence of guarded gates and ultimately have their heart weighed against a feather representing cosmic balance. 2 civilizations, separated by the Mediterranean, both converging on the idea that the underworld is something you must successfully navigate, not merely arrive at. The Maya, on the opposite side of the planet with no possible contact, built their own version. Xibalba, a realm scholars caution should not simply be read as a Maya version of hell, since survival there depended on cunning and endurance rather than moral judgment. In the Popol Vuh, two heroic brothers, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, face down a sequence of deadly trick houses, including a house of blades, a house of jaguars, and a house of biting cold, before ultimately outwitting and defeating the lords of the underworld in a ritual ball game. Was any of this treated as pure fiction by the people who actually told it, or did it shape how they understood the physical world around them? This was never treated as pure fiction by the people who told it. Sacred caves and cenotes, the deep natural sinkholes scattered across the Yucatan Peninsula, were physically understood as entrances into Xibalba itself, and archaeologists have recovered Maya pottery and ceremonial offerings from cenote systems that remain active sites of cultural significance today. Egyptian, Greek, and Maya cosmology all independently arrived at underworlds defined by trial and passage, not simple punishment, which raises an obvious question. Is this a coincidence, or is something about human psychology pulling every culture toward the same basic story? We'll come back to that question directly. First, the myth needs to take its strangest, most modern turn, because somewhere between ancient cosmology and the present day, the underworld stopped being purely symbolic for a small but influential group of people, and started being treated as a real, physical place you might someday travel to. That shift has a surprisingly traceable origin point, and it begins not in ancient scripture, but in 19th century occultism, who first took this leap from symbolic underworld to literal physical kingdom. In 1886, French esotericist Alexandre Saint-Yves d'Alvedre published a book describing a vast underground kingdom called Agartha, ruled by spiritually advanced beings he called initiates, who had supposedly preserved humanity's original wisdom and occasionally guided world events from below. He claimed to have learned of this place through astral projection rather than physical travel, and the book attracted only modest attention during his lifetime. The idea gained little further traction until 1922, when Polish writer Ferdynand Ossendowski published a hugely popular travel narrative, claiming he had personally heard first-hand accounts of this same subterranean kingdom, which he called Agartha, from people he met while crossing Mongolia during his own harrowing escape from revolutionary Russia. A French occultist's spiritual vision and a Polish writer's travel anecdote, 4 decades apart, somehow merging into what millions of people now treat as a single, coherent legend. How did two largely unrelated claims become one persistent modern myth? The answer is that Western esoteric writers did the merging themselves, deliberately. Theosophist Helena Blavatsky and her followers folded Agartha into their own teachings, describing it as a network of caves beneath Tibet, inhabited by advanced beings who occasionally contacted worthy individuals on the surface. Crucially, this is where Agartha became linked to Shambhala, the genuinely ancient Tibetan Buddhist concept central to the Kalachakra teachings. But does the actual Tibetan Buddhist tradition really describe Shambhala as a hidden kingdom underground at all? In actual Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Shambhala carries no connection to an underground kingdom at all. It is generally treated as a hidden but real, geographically separate kingdom, sometimes described in spiritual rather than strictly physical terms, awaiting the birth of a future king who will guide humanity through a coming crisis. So how, then, did this genuinely sacred tradition end up fused with an entirely separate Western invention? According to this tradition, Shambhala's significance is genuinely sacred and centuries old within Tibetan Buddhism, tied to the Kala Chakra teachings and the prophesied arrival of a future king during a period of global crisis. The underground, Atlantis-adjacent version most people now associate with the name was layered on top of it by Western occultists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not the other way around. Russian artist and mystic Nicholas Roerich led several genuine expeditions through Central Asia in the 1920s, partly motivated by an explicit search for Shambhala, blending serious travel writing with increasingly elaborate occult speculation along the way. This matters enormously because it means two very different things have been quietly merged together under one single popular legend: an authentic, centuries-old spiritual tradition on one hand, and a comparatively recent Western occult invention built mostly through astral claims and travel writing on the other. Disentangling them carefully is the first real task of this entire investigation. It gets murkier still. In the years following the First World War, German occultists, including members of the Thule Society, incorporated Agartha into a racialized mythology, speculating that the underground kingdom preserved a hidden, technologically superior remnant of an ancient Aryan civilization. Some adherents went so far as to propose expeditions toward the poles in search of an entrance, language that fed directly into Nazi-era pseudo-history more broadly. This is well-documented, troubling history, not speculation, and it is one of the clearest examples in this entire investigation of a spiritual legend being deliberately weaponized for an ideological agenda completely disconnected from its actual origins. So if Agartha is this tangled, what about Patala, the much older Hindu tradition some writers lump in alongside it? Patala is not a Western invention at all. It appears throughout genuine ancient Hindu scripture, including the Mahabharata and multiple Puranas, as the lowest of 7 layered subterranean realms, each named separately, each ruled by its own specific beings, and each described in careful, deliberate detail rather than left as a vague, catch-all underworld. The 7th and deepest layer, Patala proper, is home to a race of serpent-bodied beings called Nagas, ruled over by the great serpent king, Vaski. Crucially, and in sharp contrast to most Western ideas of an underworld, Hindu texts go out of their way to describe Patala as beautiful rather than grim. Filled with jewels, fragrant groves, golden palaces, and light produced by gemstones embedded in the hoods of its serpent inhabitants, with one sage in the Vishnu Purana reportedly describing it as more delightful than heaven itself. A subterranean realm imagined not as punishment, but as a rival paradise, rich enough to rival heaven itself in the eyes of the very sages who described it. That single detail should already complicate any simple, one-size-fits-all theory of why humans imagine worlds below. Nagas themselves carry real, continuing religious significance across South and Southeast Asia today, not merely as mythological footnotes. They are still actively worshipped at temple festivals such as Nag Panchami, celebrated annually in July or August, when devotees offer milk to living snakes and pray for protection from snakebite. Nagas are also believed to inhabit specific rivers, lakes, and sacred groves maintained by villages throughout the region, and are regularly depicted guarding the entrances of Hindu and Buddhist temples in stone carving that visitors can see today. Their serpentine bodies often forming the staircase balustrades themselves. This is a living tradition, not a dead one revived for modern entertainment. So we have, so far, three very different categories tangled into one popular idea. Ancient, sincere religious cosmology, describing realms of the dead or the divine. A separate ancient tradition, describing an underworld as a paradise rather than a punishment. And a comparatively recent Western esoteric invention claiming actual physical, inhabited kingdoms beneath our feet. Untangling those three threads is most of this investigation's real work. If ancient cultures were this consistent in imagining underworlds, did any of them actually build real structures underground, structures we can walk into today and verify directly? They did. And this is where myth gives way to something concrete and remarkable. Real underground cities, carved not by gods or lost civilizations, but by ordinary people solving ordinary, urgent problems. In the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, more than 200 underground settlements have been carved into a soft volcanic rock called tuff. Easy enough to excavate by hand, yet stable enough to support enormous structures without modern reinforcement, spread across an area of volcanic landscape covering more than 7,000 square miles. The largest known example, Derinkuyu, descends roughly 85 meters across at least 18 levels, and could shelter as many as 20,000 people, along with their livestock and food stores, sealed from the inside using massive rolling stone doors that could isolate each floor independently if invaders broke through one level. A city for 20,000 people, hidden entirely beneath ordinary farmland, large enough that residents above ground for centuries had no idea it existed beneath their feet. What would drive an entire community to build something on that scale, entirely out of sight? Mainstream archaeologists generally conclude Derinkuyu's earliest sections may date as far back as the Hittite or Phrygian periods, but the city reached its fullest form during the Byzantine era, expanded specifically as protection from Arab raids between the 8th and 12th centuries, then used again centuries later as refuge from Mongol incursions and subsequent persecution. The site fell out of use only after a 1923 population exchange forced its final inhabitants to leave Turkey entirely, taking the knowledge of its existence with them. It was rediscovered purely by accident in 1963, when a resident knocking down a wall in his own basement broke through into a room that should not have been there. How did thousands of people manage to actually survive for extended periods that far underground without modern ventilation technology? The engineering answer is more impressive than mysterious. Derinkuyu's builders carved a network of more than 50 vertical shafts and chimneys, specifically to circulate fresh air through every level and vent smoke away from underground kitchens, while a single deep central shaft doubled as the city's water well, sealable from below in case of siege. Wine presses, stables, churches, and storage cellars filled out the rest of the complex, turning what began as a simple refuge into something closer to a fully functioning, self-sufficient town that simply happened to exist below ground, rather than above it. So was Derinkuyu's true purpose really this mundane, or has speculation found its way in anyway? Derinkuyu's purpose, in other words, was never esoteric. It was survival architecture, built and rebuilt over centuries by people responding to real, repeated, documented threats. That has not stopped speculation from creeping in regardless. One well-known fringe writer, visiting the site decades ago, concluded its scale could only be explained by extraterrestrial involvement. There is currently no evidence supporting that claim, and the historical record, refugees, soft volcanic rock, and centuries of warfare already explains what's there without it. If human ambition could carve a city this size by hand, what has nature managed to carve entirely on its own? Underground engineering on a different scale entirely appears in nature itself, requiring no human builders at all. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is the longest known cave system on Earth, with more than 426 miles of mapped passageway and counting, formed roughly 330 million years ago in ancient limestone, left behind by a sea that no longer exists. Indigenous peoples used sections of the cave for shelter and resource gathering for at least 5,000 years before European settlers ever entered it, and the system continues to grow longer nearly every year as cavers connect newly discovered passageways to the known network. Has this fascination with the cave always stayed purely scientific, or has it occasionally turned into something darker? The cave's pull on the human imagination has occasionally turned tragic rather than merely curious. In 1925, an experienced local caver named Floyd Collins became trapped beneath a fallen rock in a narrow passage of the nearby sand cave system, igniting a rescue effort that became a national media sensation, with newspapers running daily updates as crews tried desperately to reach him. Collins ultimately died of exposure and starvation before rescuers could free him, but the public attention his case generated helped build the political momentum that led, 16 years later, to Mammoth Cave's official designation as a national park. That same fascination also had a far less noble side. Competing local cave owners once engaged in what became known as the Kentucky Cave Wars, deploying deliberately misleading roadside signs and hired men to intercept unsuspecting tourists before they ever reached Mammoth Cave itself. If Mammoth Cave represents the longest cave system ever mapped, is there a cave system larger in sheer volume rather than length? There is, and it was found astonishingly recently. Son Doong Cave in central Vietnam, whose name simply means mountain river cave, was confirmed in 2009 as the largest cave passage on Earth by volume, large enough in places that an entire city block, towers included, could fit inside a single chamber, with stalagmites rising as tall as 70 meters, the largest ever recorded anywhere. How could something so genuinely enormous have stayed essentially unknown to the outside world for so long? A section of its ceiling collapsed in the ancient past, allowing sunlight to reach the floor far below, and botanists later discovered that an entire self-contained jungle ecosystem had taken root inside the cave, essentially identical to the forest growing in the open air above it. A local man named Ho Khan first stumbled across the cave's entrance by chance in 1990 while sheltering from a jungle storm. But it took nearly 2 decades, and the arrival of a British-led caving expedition in 2009, before anyone returned to properly survey and confirm its true scale. a genuine jungle growing quietly inside a mountain, unknown to international science until little more than a decade ago. If something this immense could remain effectively hidden from the wider world until as recently as 2009, what does that tell us about how much of the planet's interior space genuinely remains unexplored, even today? That question brings this investigation directly to its most controversial chapter, because the gap between merely unexplored and supposedly inhabited by lost civilizations is exactly where modern hollow earth theory has spent more than 3 centuries trying to live. Did this idea begin as outright fantasy, or did it once have a foothold in genuine science? The idea did not begin as fringe pseudoscience. In the late 17th century, the respected English astronomer Edmund Halley, the same Halley who correctly predicted the return of his namesake comet, proposed to the Royal Society that Earth might consist of several nested, concentric shells, separated by atmospheres potentially capable of supporting life. His reasoning was grounded in a genuine, observed anomaly. Ship captains had reported for years that their compasses did not always point reliably toward true north, and Halley theorized that separate, independently rotating inner shells, each with its own magnetic field, could account for the inconsistency far better than a single uniform planet could. Halley even speculated the aurora might be caused by luminous gas escaping through thin material near the poles. A serious, credentialed scientist taking a hollow planet seriously as a genuine working hypothesis, using real observational anomalies as his supporting evidence. So at what point did this stop being legitimate science and start becoming something else entirely? The turn came surprisingly fast. Mainstream geologists generally conclude the idea was already scientifically dead by the mid-18th century, first cast into serious doubt by Pierre Bouguer's 1740 gravity measurements, then definitively disproven by Charles Hutton's Schiehallion experiment around 1774, which calculated Earth's density directly and found it far too solid throughout to be hollow. If the science had already settled this question by the 1770s, why would anyone keep pursuing it half a century later? By the time American veteran John Cleves Simmis, Jr. began publicly campaigning in 1818 for an expedition to find massive openings he believed existed at both poles, complete with warm, habitable land, thriving animal life, and an inner sun illuminating it all, the scientific community had already moved on entirely. Undeterred, Sims pledged his own life to the search and spent the next decade lecturing anyone who would listen, even petitioning the United States Congress directly for funding. He never secured the government-backed expedition he wanted, though his persistent lobbying is credited with helping inspire, indirectly, the nation's first official scientific voyage to Antarctica 2 decades later. Simmis failed to find his hole at the pole, but the legend refused to die quietly, and it would resurface one more time in the 20th century, wearing a very different disguise. So how did this 19th century failure manage to attach itself to a famous, real 20th century explorer? When American Admiral Richard Byrd genuinely flew over both the North and South Poles in 1926 and 1929, he reported exactly what modern geology predicted: ice, ocean, and continent, no openings of any kind. Decades later, Hollow Earth writers, Most notably, Raymond Bernard, in his 1969 book on the subject, began quoting fragments of Bird's own statements wildly out of context, constructing an entirely false narrative in which the famous explorer had secretly confirmed polar openings rather than disproven them. A genuine historical explorer's own words, misquoted decades after the fact, to support a claim that explorers' actual expeditions had already disproven. There is currently no evidence that hollow Earth theory is scientifically supported in any form. Modern seismology, the same technology used to study earthquakes, tracks how seismic waves bend, slow, and bounce as they pass through different layers deep inside the planet. And this method has mapped Earth's interior in extraordinary detail: a solid inner core, a molten outer core, a thick mantle, all consistent with a uniformly dense, completely solid planet from crust to center, with no concealed cavities large enough to hide civilizations of any kind. If the physical claim collapses this thoroughly under modern measurement, why does the underlying idea keep returning anyway, generation after generation, dressed in new evidence each time? Perhaps the persistence itself is the real story here, more than any specific claim about tunnels or polar openings ever was. This is where the investigation needs to shift from asking what is physically true to asking what is psychologically true, because those are very different questions with very different kinds of answers. Carl Jung and later scholars of comparative mythology, most famously Joseph Campbell, argued that descent narratives, journeys into darkness followed by a return to light, represent one of the most consistent narrative patterns in all of human storytelling, appearing in myth, religious ritual, and even ordinary dreams across cultures with no possible contact with one another. Campbell's own comparative survey of world mythology repeatedly identified this same descent and return structure at the center of hero stories from entirely unrelated traditions, treating it less as a coincidence and more as a recurring shape the human imagination naturally falls into when confronting fear, loss, or transformation. According to this interpretation, the underworld functions less as a literal destination and more as a powerful symbol for psychological transformation, confronting fear, loss, or the unconscious mind, and emerging changed by the encounter. Is this pattern really universal, or simply common enough in well-known traditions to look that way? This is not merely an abstract theory imposed from outside these traditions. The Hopi and other Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest still build a small ceremonial hole called a sipapu into the floor of every kiva, their underground ceremonial chamber, explicitly representing the place their ancestors emerged from a previous world into this one. Hopi tradition describes not one emergence, but several, with humanity moving upward through a sequence of earlier worlds, each eventually destroyed by the consequences of human wrongdoing, before finally reaching this current, fourth world. Is this emergent story treated purely as ancient legend, or does it still shape an identifiable place on the map today? According to this tradition, guided by Spider Grandmother, the people climbed up through this final opening after the previous world had been destroyed, transforming from lizard-like beings into fully human form the moment they stepped into the light. This point of emergence is identified with a specific, physical location within the Grand Canyon itself, and the ritual significance of the sipapu remains actively practiced in Pueblo communities today, not preserved merely as historical curiosity. A real, identifiable canyon, treated simultaneously as ordinary literal geography and as the sacred spiritual origin point of an entire people. That dual nature, physical and symbolic at once, may be the single most honest description available of what most underworld traditions actually are. So, gathering every thread this investigation has followed, what does the evidence actually show? It shows that real, physical underground spaces, both human-built and entirely natural, are vastly larger and more numerous than most people assume, and that ancient societies repeatedly built extraordinary things beneath the surface for entirely practical, well-documented reasons. Shelter from invasion, escape from persecution, protection from climate, ordinary geological accident. It shows that descent into darkness and return is one of the most universal narrative structures in human storytelling, independently appearing on every inhabited continent, almost certainly because it reflects something real and shared about human psychology, rather than anything resembling shared physical contact with an actual underground civilization. And it shows that the literal Hollow Earth hypothesis, taken as physical fact, was tested by science centuries ago and found false repeatedly by completely independent methods. But does that settle everything? Or is one question still left standing? What remains genuinely unresolved, and likely always will, is the deeper question of why this particular symbol, a world below, proved so universally compelling in the first place when human cultures had an effectively unlimited number of other ways to represent fear, death, mystery, and transformation. Some researchers suggest this points to something fundamental in how human consciousness organizes the unknown spatially, treating up as visible, known, and safe, and down as hidden, uncertain, and powerful. Mainstream anthropologists generally conclude this is sufficient on its own, requiring no shared ancient contact and no hidden technology to explain the pattern. But if the psychology is sufficient, does that settle every remaining question, or only the ones science is actually equipped to answer? What the evidence does not show, and what no credentialed researcher has demonstrated, is that any inner Earth civilization physically exists today, that Agartha has been located or confirmed, that Hollow Earth theory holds any scientific support whatsoever, that any giant or supernatural guardian protects underground entrances, or that the Mesopotamian deity Enki, or any other specific god from any tradition, ever ruled an actual physical kingdom beneath the surface of this planet. So where does that leave the mystery this investigation set out to examine? Perhaps the real discovery isn't a hidden kingdom at all, but something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. The sheer consistency of human imagination working on the exact same problem from every corner of the globe, with no way to compare notes, and arriving again and again at strikingly similar answers. A Hopi sipapu in a kiva floor, a Greek shade crossing into Hades, an Egyptian sun god battling chaos through 12 dark hours, a Hindu sage marveling at jewels in Patala, a Vietnamese cave revealing its own forgotten jungle to sunlight after millions of years of darkness. Whether that consistency reflects a buried memory of something we no longer fully understand, or simply the full, strange depth of the human mind, facing the dark and needing every single time to imagine something waiting on the other side of it, is a question this investigation cannot fully close. Maybe no investigation ever could. What we can say with confidence is only this: long before anyone claimed to have found a door to the world below, humans were already digging one, carving one, dreaming one, and walking, generation after generation, toward the edge of the dark to see what might be waiting there.